Start before we get the images up on the screen. As I say, Bert and I will be sharing this presentation. I'll be starting off giving a very quick overview of some of the numbers involved in Bach-Goldberg variations, partly to help set up the piece for this evening's performance, and then Bernard will follow up with a more discussion on how some mathematical ideas have fed into our particular interpretation that we'll be presenting tonight. Sorry, I'll just restart this. Will just be a minute. Thank you. Can't get this thing to move. Let me just get my okay. There we have him. Thank you. Before we get to Bach, I just want to put a little mathematical idea to you which shows my limitations as a mathematician. This insight came from a film by Andrei Tarkovsky called Nostalgia. It has to do with a man who makes the observation that if you get a raindrop and you get another raindrop and you add them together, you get a raindrop. So in other words, 1 and 1 equals 1. So one of the recurring themes that Bernard and I will be touching on today is this idea of maths, not so much as something which generates the content as much as a metaphor that can be useful for us as performers to open up different possibilities. I love this particular metaphor, of course, particularly as we're doing the Goldberg variations on two pianos. One pianist and one pianist hopefully will come together to give some sort of coherent unity. Back to Bach. Now, as we've encountered a few times in this symposium, of course, numbers are everywhere in music. And right back to Pythagoras, there was this tradition of seeing music in numerical terms. Certainly by the 18th century, I suppose this tradition of seeing music as a reflection of the harmony of the spheres was less prominent than it might have been, but what we might call this Pythagorean tradition was certainly alive and well. Here's a quote from Volta, who describes music as a heavenly philosophical science based specifically on mathematics. This is just an interesting quote insofar as some years later he was one of Bach's inner circle in Leipzig, so Bach was very much aware of these ideas. Just very quickly, also in Leipzig was Mitzler, who was a physician, who was a mathematician, who established specifically a society that would help to understand music as a mathematical science. Bach actually was admitted to this rather exclusive society in 1746, a few years after writing the Goldberg variations. To be admitted, he had to submit his qualifications. He submitted a 6-part canon or canonic variations on Himmel hoch, which fortunately was successful. So the sense in which Bach was absolutely involved with people who were seeing music as a mathematical science is a historical fact. This very famous image of Bach here was made in 1746, the year that he did join Mitzler's society, and he's holding a little piece of music there. If you were able to look at it closely, you'd see that that piece of music is a set of 14 canons. Hugely condensed, beautiful, almost with the brevity and depth of a mathematical equation, all in its most distilled form. So this is the image that he wanted for posterity, to be seen as this type of figure. The fact that there are 14 canons here is not a coincidence. Certainly Bach saw all sorts of numbers in all sorts of things, including in his name. B, of course, is the second letter of the alphabet, A, the first letter, C, the third. So the letters of Bach's name come to 14, and as many people have noted, this number 14 turns up in all sorts of symbolic ways in much of Bach's music. There's a whole long history of people finding and seeking numbers in Bach's music and seeing intense symbolism in these numbers. So not necessarily just for mathematical reasons, but for example, the number 3, obviously tied to the idea of Trinity, Father, Son and Holy Ghost. The number 10, concerned with the 10 Commandments. There are many others, but these two, I suppose, in particular are of particular importance in the Goldberg variations. Now, another factor of the Goldberg variations I should mention is that it's not a variations on a theme. It's a variations upon a ground bass, above a ground bass. So it starts with a glorious aria, which has the most beautiful melodic quality, but we're not having variations upon that melody. We're having variations upon a foundation that underlies it. And it's important to recognize that this foundation wasn't something that Bach invented new. It was actually something that many composers had worked with, and he would have been very aware of this. Here's just a few examples here of other composers who've worked with essentially the same underlying foundation. So the Goldberg in many ways is not important for its radical originality, but the sense in which it dialogues with past traditions is an important aspect of it. You can see most of these examples here on the screen, 8-bar phrases, except for that nice one at the bottom by Purcell, which is a 7-bar one. But Bach wasn't being asymmetrical in this piece. We can see here the pattern that underlies each of the Goldberg variations. You can see 2 groups of 16 bars, both of them repeated, 4 groups of 8 bars, both of them finishing in a cadence, the first in the tonic, the second in the dominant, again, absolutely conventional, the third in the relative minor, and of course the fourth back in the tonic. So it's a very, in many ways, a very 4-square sort of structure that he is building upon. So 32 bars, which are repeated. It's also typical of Bach that the same sort of principles operate on different levels. So the 32 bars of the theme has a direct sort of parallel with the 32 pieces that make up the set. And again, we can see this, even the division we saw within the theme is there within the piece itself. So, for example, there's the aria that starts the work, also concludes the work, so it's symmetrical in that sense. Variation 16, if you're listening tonight, you'll recognise Variation 16 because it starts with a French overture. It's a very strong dotted rhythm. It's like a fresh start. So it's pretty clear from even a listener's point of view that there are 2 halves to this work, with a very clear beginning of the second half. And of course 32 obviously breaking down into 2 16s, or in this case 1 plus 15, 15 plus 1. On the other hand, one can also see the 32 in another way. The 30 variations being divided into 3 groups of 10. Again, this is a very real one for us in performance because number 10 is a fuguetta. It has a very clear sense of a finish in the middle of the piece, a third of the way through. Number 20, again, is one of the most brilliant pieces in the set. It comes just before a beautiful slow minor one. So again, it's a very clear sense of dividing the piece into 3. 3 times 10 plus 2 is 32, or of course 10 times 3. This is probably the better known structure that underlies the Goldberg variations, is to see it in terms of groups of 3 variations. And these variations form a pretty regular pattern. You can see in most of the groups it starts with a character piece, often a sort of dance type piece. It's followed by a duet, usually one that involves hand crossing, usually quite virtuosic piece. And then the third piece of each group is a canon, very strict musical form. And of course the canons, as many of you will know, are ordered in a highly structured way. The first canon is at the unison, that is, the second voice follows the first voice in unison. The second canon at the second, so it's 1 step apart, at the third, the fourth, the fifth, going up to the 9th. You might have expected a canon at the 10th, but he throws in this, well, for reasons we don't have time to go into today, a quadlibet, but there's a very important sort of structure going through the piece of these highly ingenious contrapuntal forms that give us yet another sense of shape. Now, what you can see here again is the same sort of numbers operating on many levels of the structure. So you can see it divided into 2, you can see the form divided into 3. Similarly, you can see, oh, actually I'm going to come to that shortly. Here's another abstract representation of the Goldberg variations, and as you're listening tonight, it's a long work. Knowing where you are actually is a useful thing when you're listening to a long work. You know how close you are, and I suppose the canons are one of these things that will help you know where you are. I think this can be helpful, except that actually in the Goldberg variations you're not going to find this as easy as you might imagine. You might imagine that a canon is really quite a clear thing to hear, but actually a lot of the 2-part inventions have lots of free imitation. And here, for example, is the first canon at the unison. You can see the top line there in the first bar is one of the voices in the second bar as well, and that is maintained obviously strictly throughout. But immediately you can see that the parts are crossing over each other, and you've got this third part underneath that actually isn't part of the canon, that is just a separate supporting role. So, in fact, listening to a canon and hearing a canon is actually much more difficult than you might imagine, and Bach hasn't particularly made it easy to do that. As I say, many of the pieces are in three parts. Again, these ideas of dividing into two, dividing into three is there in terms of the larger structures of the whole, the structures of the variations themselves, but also in the textures. Most of them, or more of them, in three parts than others, but as I say, many duets in there as well as some four-part ones. And of course, the time signatures, unlike most variations, certainly in the Baroque period, that maintained pretty regular time signature throughout, there's a huge profusion of time signatures. Most of these pieces are in different sets of character, different sets of tempo. But again, these numbers, 3 and 2, and all their relationships are throughout. Even just a very, very quick example here. So even the pieces that might be written in 3/4 time, of course, can be divided into two as well. 6 quavers. Many of us will know, of course, the hemiola, which is this very common Baroque device that plays between 3 and the time of 2. But this variation here, right hand certainly looks like it's in 3/4. Da 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 da. We try and make an emphasis on that third beat. But the left hand, bop 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 boom, ba da 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 bop bop boom, ba da da da. So there's 3 and 2 on everywhere you look at it. This same principle is there. Now, how far are we going to go and look for numbers in the Goldberg variations? I just want to leave this one here for 10 seconds for you to just have a little look at. This is from an article on the web by someone who started to count the number of bars in the Goldberg variations and look for the symbolic meaning that might be there. So 128 bars has some significance because if you translate credo into numbers, that gives us 43 and 3 times. From a performance point of view, the extent of this actually isn't that useful, I must say. Certainly the 3s and the 2s, for my rather simplistic mind, is something that one comes across all the time. The 3s, as I said, groups of 3 variations, 3 of them are in a minor key, most of them in 3 parts and all those triple time signatures. The 2s are everywhere, exact halves, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32 is everywhere, often in 2 parts, often in duple time signatures. 2 keys, a major key and a minor key. There's a lot of G major tonight. It was written for a 2 manual harpsichord, so it had 2 keyboards. Tonight we're going to be playing it in a version I made for 2 pianos. Another 2, which may help to justify it. The reasoning behind this, very briefly, was this thought of trying to clarify the lines. As I say, a lot of this music is crossing over and is very complex, and the thought that we would build a sense of dialogue between the contrapuntal lines was hugely, it seemed a very compelling thing to try. Also, this sense of actually building in a human interaction within the piece. So it's not just one person who's dealing with extraordinary contrapuntal complexities over the top of each other, but being able to shape the lines independently and to have them respond to each other, we hoped would bring some sort of new dimension to the work. We may touch on that again later. Now, one of the things that this is the point we really want to come to. As I say, there's all sorts of shapes and mathematical relationships already embedded in the structure of the Goldberg variations. But I touched on this earlier. Actually, the conceptual abstract shapes actually don't coincide with the perceptual shapes that you as listeners will hear or that we as performers hear. I mean, for a start, the variations are in radically different tempi and therefore radically different durations. Some of them last under a minute. One of them goes for about 6 minutes. So the relative proportions are quite different. The sense of shape, the sense of groupings of them aren't necessarily in the way that abstract form presents. So you have this nice sort of doubling up of Bach's abstract shape against a quite distinct perceptual shape. Just want to remind you of a fact that is very striking in relation to this piece. For over 200 years, this was a work that was known of by musical connoisseurs, but was viewed as a rather arcane set of ingenious but rather boring contrapuntal exercises. It was very rarely performed. And this changed metaphorically overnight when Glenn Gould released his recording in 1955. Glenn Gould, I might add immediately, was not at all concerned with representing the composer's intentions or historically informed performance. He played it on a piano, for goodness sake, an instrument that Bach would not have known. But after 1955, we have this weird situation that a piece that was viewed as very esoteric has suddenly become almost his most frequently performed and certainly most frequently recorded work. As I say, everybody knew the cleverness of what Bach had put into it, but actually it was through a performer that actually enabled us to perceive this work as we'd never heard it before, that its reputation, its reception history just switches radically. I suppose it's one of the for us, encouraging moves in terms of music research has been a move away from just the study of scores. And I think this idea that there might be all sorts of maths within the relationships within Bach actually is a dangerous one for recognition of actually what the performers have to do. So if you see a piece as this mathematical construction, as an abstract shape, and see the performer's role as merely one who just reflects that shape, who just translates that between the composer and the listener, then the performer's role here is not very important. In fact, there's a long tradition of seeing the performer's role as essentially uncreative, as essentially one that just translates the notes. Fortunately, since the invention of MIDI, it's been very, very clear to us that just actually reproducing the relationships in the score is not at all aesthetically satisfying. But there's still a legacy, certainly within musicology, music scholarship, to be thinking about music in terms of the stuff embedded in the scores, rather than the real stuff, of course, which is when it turns into sound. Nicholas Cook refers to this as Plato's curse, this sense that sees performers just as people who reproduce works rather than having a genuinely creative contribution. Performers seen as unfortunate middlemen between composer and listener. You still hear this touted around in certain circles that the performer should be transparent and should not impose his or her personality upon the work. It should just enable the composer's ideas just to speak directly to the audience. That orthodoxy, I think, has had its day and hopefully is passing. There was a long tradition there of seeing performers as people who distorted the composer's intentions. I think this is really, really unhelpful, and it's great that music research is starting to recognise the role that performers have to do in music, and that this is not a simple role of reproduction, but that in fact musical meaning is constructed through performance. And I think Glenn Gould and the Goldberg Variations gives us an absolutely perfect example of this, that we were absolutely able to engage with the work through when performance opened up its possibilities. So people were critical of Glenn Gould because they said, oh, people aren't listening to Bach anymore, they're just listening to Glenn Gould, and that he's imposing his ego upon the music. But actually, I think that's also very unhelpful. It seems to me that the benefit of this sort of music comes not from composer or performer, but this wonderful, wonderful dance, this wonderful dialogue between the two of them, between the past some centuries ago, and the present, the dead composer, the live human being who brings it to life in the present, in the very specific circumstances of now. Between the fixed and the fluid, between the intellectual and the intuitive. They were the last ones I could think of that actually shared the same opening letter, but between the abstract and its human realization, between the notated and the improvised. If any of you know Bruce Ellis Benson's book on the improvisation of musical dialogue, makes this point that actually you play a classical musical piece, you may not be making up so many of the notes, but you're absolutely improvising. There's no question about that. I'm happy to discuss that later. Between the enduring and the ineffable. So these things that might seem contradictions, that might seem incompatible, actually in a real dialectical way go together. We're not talking about either or. It's not thought or feeling, composer or performer, but both of them. And so I just leave you with that thought that 1 + 1 hopefully equals 1. I'll now pass over to Bernard to say a few words. Thank you.
As Stephen suggested, what we're looking at today is not really the Goldberg variations in performance, but in one particular performance in a particular space and time. And what we want to do now is look at the processes we've been through a little bit in getting to at least this moment on the way to that moment. So we obviously play somewhere between 6:15 and 7. We're quite close to that moment, and we've been exploring the preparation for that for a couple of months. The interesting aspect of this is a lot of what we're about to touch on now would normally not be shared with the audience. And I think in many, many ways, that sense that so much of what we do is tacit is unfortunate. So this is a sharing. It has to be very brief. It's not a scientific study. It's just conjecture or reflections, whatever. A lot of what we're talking about, we haven't measured. And we are actually seeking today to do a performance that we couldn't repeat, so it's not replicable. It's been interesting even these few days and over the last few years, with Elaine or Gerard yesterday, or Christopher today, where you can begin to see ways in which it is possible to map, to define, to clarify in greater specificity what we might be doing. And I do think even some of the things we've done to this point could be taken forward by, for example, an analysis of the performance we will do later today and begin to map. But we haven't done that. Our ambition today is to be as creative as we dare in the performance. And I was really grateful for Margaret's description of true creativity, which was what matters is what's happening in us, more than whether you think it's creative from a historical perspective or so on, because it gives us the freedom to be creative. Some of the things I'm going to share now, other people have taken further. I discover that by my own journey of creativity, and then you start exploring what other people are doing. We end up in dialogue. I'm extremely grateful to the Center for Musical Performance's creative practice, because over the last few years it's given us this freedom and it's given the opportunity for dialogue to think about the creative dimensions of performance, and I think it's helped us move some of these dimensions forward. I think there's a beautiful irony in that at the Shape and the Music and Shape conference, I think, John, you were chairing the session when Elaine and I were presenting about the work that in a way linked into Helen Pryor's study and so on, and some of that is therefore very much to influence what we're doing here today. And it's fascinating to see some of the groupings of those various parameters that you brought up today, because we will look a little bit at some of those a little bit later. In the final column of one of John's presentations, there were a series of ways in which you can impact on your insights through performance. But on the piano, these actually become significantly more limited. And I think actually what they affect, and I'm doing them in what I think is real-time priority of ordering, and it does reflect back to Kohn, that the first thing you can play with is time, micro-timing. The second one you're conscious of is dynamic, or even subconscious influences that are dynamic, articulation, and timbre, at least in the sense in which you can do voicing, and so on. These are what you can actually do. A lot of the other things we're looking at are influences that might predefine our interpretive choices, but in the moment they're affecting the subconscious as they map into those elements. And the final thing is, of course, we're trying to do that to reflect to you our responses to the music in the hope that you might receive some of those responses. But that aspect works with you. I wanted to touch very briefly on one other thing, because it's of critical importance in how I'm going to open up the next point, and that is, for the last few years I've been working particularly looking at metaphor from different fields. If you like, this idea of mapping a field onto music. So here we are, it's no accident we're doing music and maths. We did cognition and maths before. We didn't do that, actually. We did cognition and music before. So we try to map these different things, and it's been a personal study for me as well. It began with cognitive linguistics, and the concepts of prosody that Christopher brought up before were something that I found incredibly interesting in reinforming how I might approach particular performances. It went for me to molecular biology. It went also into sort of business principles. It's been linked for me to neuroscience, and this time, because of the circumstances we're in, this performance has been influenced by mathematics. So we get to Einstein's general theory of relativity somehow. No, we get to mathematics. This began as a very simple idea before I ever thought I'd be having to share this with anyone at all. I'm going to spend 2.5 months looking at aspects of the Goldberg variations, and I thought it'd be interesting to map a piece that I was sure I wouldn't fully understand at the end of that process to another thing I've never really understood, and that was Einstein's general theory of general theory of relativity. What I found particularly interesting was the concept that buried in there are, of course, 10 field equations from Einstein, and in the same way that you can justify this shaping of the Goldberg variations into 10 sections with bits and pieces. The other thing, of course, that's interesting is the field equations actually just break up a narrative, and they are also ways in which maths have been employed, for example, to explore physical states and so on. So there's mapping of studies onto one onto the other. Don't worry, I'm not going to show that energy equals dynamics and maths equals this or something like that. It's much more looking at this process at a metaphorical level, because I think it's been, for me, profoundly influential in reconsidering how I approach performance. I never expected this. I actually thought what we'd be doing is some sort of music and maths would show us what we could map so that we would then be confident what we couldn't map, and we'd get back to the sort of Diderot, the Diderot quote that we're actually having a panel look at 5 o'clock this afternoon. But in fact, what's happened on this journey for me personally is a radical transformation from that expectation. It's completely changed the way I think about performance. Just so that we can throw up some equations on a board. They have nothing to do with the Goldberg variations whatsoever. But there are some interesting things about exploring the general theory of relativity, which is now 100 years old. In that first of all, if you look at the history of it, you have to go back to Newton. And it was almost, you're trying to explain something by taking out some of the variables so that you can look at what the relationships were independent of those variables. So let's have it all happen in a vacuum, for example. And then later on along comes Einstein and starts playing with other dimensions of that experience, but still kept out some variables. That was the specific, that was the sort of, the 1905 sort of study looking more specifically at particular contexts of relativity. The general one was therefore fundamentally to introduce gravity. But the other thing that happens in Einstein's work, which I think is really fascinating, is the concept you go back to basic axioms and you reconsider them. I feel actually this process for me has been absolutely profound in getting me to go back to some of the basic axioms of performance. This afternoon's performance of the Goldberg variations, for me, is much less fixed than I would normally walk onto stage with. It's extremely dangerous for me. Also, having done some cognitive work, I know that by wanting to stay in that free space, other things that may normally not be dared, that you wouldn't dare to compromise, I'm actually prepared, it's okay to compromise. The Goldberg variation notes, if you want to hear the notes, there are some wonderful recordings out there, about 70 currently on Spotify, and you can hear all the right notes most of the time. What we're really looking to do is looking at shapes, dialogues, and something else which will come up in a minute. The various dimensions of the piece, as we saw before, well, I suppose I'll jump straight to the most profound thing for me in looking at this. What you're looking at is an equation full of variables. Some of the variables are and also the equations themselves are variations on each other. Some of the variables are covariant. So in other words, if you do one thing, if you're looking at the influence on one thing, it links to the influence on another. And I think in certain performance decisions, there are covariant dimensions. In other contexts, you're actually dealing with really quite complex or even potentially random variables which come into an equation. The fascinating thing about some of the field equations is, of course, the variations become more or less complex depending on what you sort of factor out. And I think you go through the history of studying music and you can go from things that look just at the score to now we've got Nick Cook looking at the concept of the work as a work in performance. Yet actually, is there really only one concept of the work in performance? Or is every performance a slightly different variation on that? So you've got a whole series of variables which are arguably sitting defined in a very complex equation. The equation manifests itself as the score. When one looks at a score as something that desires a solution specific to its context, as opposed to there is only one solution for the equation, you end up with a much more dynamic opportunity in terms of how one works towards a particular performance. To give some illustration of this, we're really going to factor things down very particularly. The first bar of the Goldberg variation. Goldberg's variations, as they manifest themselves in 10 different manifestations here. It's essentially a journey from G to F sharp. Mathematically, the probability that a bass line will move from G to F sharp in G major is fairly high. What happens above the G and what happens above the F sharp? Also, there are probabilities, and certainly Bach begins with probably the most probable probability. So the great news is almost all of us could have written the first note of the Goldberg variations. Where it gets more interesting is the second note of the Goldberg variations. I'm not sure that's very probable. It's still a G, but wouldn't it normally be? The fact he repeats the G already brings something distinctive and interesting to the energy of the piece. It actually gives momentum. And if we would follow it through, of course, suddenly we've introduced dissonance, which should come back to there. So if we just take that far, one could obviously be mapping probabilities. One begins to establish a sense of geometry through time. If we see it metaphorically as ways of mapping, there will be different levels of energy. We haven't yet worked out from that much music, if you've never seen the score and didn't know anything about the piece, how long this piece is going to be. Probably we're going to be feeling comfortable because of the G to the F sharp in the bass that we've probably moved to the second of a group of 4, which might become a group of 8, which might become a group of 16, which might become a group of 32 in terms of probability. The game you then see with Bach, the sense of play, is how, just look at the bass line, how you play with the Gs and the F sharps. In terms of which pitch, there's always Gs and F sharps. How long, 3/4 versus 3/4 versus 3/8 versus 3/2 versus 2/4. A very quick ornamental F sharp straight after the G, so that the next F sharp's 4 notes later rather than 1 note later. As you work through the 10, you can see, and these are not the only ones, all sorts of potential variations on that manipulation. Surely this is not a composer who's trying to ask us to fix what we do, when he's constantly playing with what you might predict. The other thing I find potentially even more fascinating is how many variations he could have written on those 2 bars, or even how many he did. There was a point a couple of months ago when I thought what's really interesting about this is not that there are all the maths we heard before, but in fact that it's distilled back to such a small set. He could have improvised this every day easily. But somehow he's wanting to shape, and he sets up all sorts of games for us as performers to play, which Stephen indicated before. If you're going to get from the first bar of the top left to the first bar of the middle of the top, the sense of setting up for an audience to be ready to be surprised, and there are constant surprises, is going to be one of the games that we'll be playing along the line of time. The game is played partly by what happens in the next first bar, and obviously partly by what happened in relation to the last first bar. As I say, the games we can play with at any moment in time play with the concepts of timing. For example, do we count as a sort of as the simplest of Moogs might count it, or does the fact it's a character start playing with our concept of the normal density of probabilities for the beat because it's a particular character, or do the games of dissonance and consonance and expectation and surprise also give us the freedom to play with timing? In terms of density of probability, you've got lots of possibilities for hearing this first bar. There's 70 plus on Spotify at present. There are jazz forms, there are swingle singer forms. There's all sorts of things you can hear with as variations out of the same notes. What Bach doesn't do is fix very much. He doesn't tell you what tempos. He doesn't tell you dynamics. Very rarely does he tell you articulations, though interestingly, in the first bar of the theme he does. What's very fascinating is he gives you the slur from the second to the third beat, but then he doesn't slur it anywhere else. Yet virtually every recording you will hear will just assume there should be a slur. The number of people who have said they're really looking forward to coming at 6:15 because they love Glenn Gould's recording comes back to Stephen's point. How has our sort of imagination been restricted by somebody who was actually absolutely inspired and excited imaginatively by something no one had seen before? So the fact that there's so many commonalities here. But there are also many, many differences. So just to give you some sense of the diversity of potential variations of a performance of the Goldberg variations. Oops. Sorry.
Okay. Want to play?
Yes, let's do it. Just check the sound. No, where's it? What I love most about the concept, I think, of the general theory of relativity is the idea of adding dimensions and finding connections that maybe hadn't been explored before. The limitation on interpretation, perhaps, is symbolized by Einstein himself at the end of this quote from a letter of 1918, to find the simplest and most transparent of systems. So on the one hand, we dance to be as free as possible, but maybe, as with mathematics, we're also searching for eloquence and depth. Thank you.
We have just about 10 minutes for questions, so in view of the time, I will open